Whether you're a Democrat, Republican, or an independent, I hate to tell you, but we have a problem. With the presidential election around the corner and Joe Biden finally making the announcement that he will run for a second term, an issue has come up, and it has to do with something few Americans give much thought to. See, Joe Biden and the Democratic Party has decided that he's running unopposed, and for some reason, the mainstream media has decided to play along. So despite having two primary challengers, they've decided that he will be the one and only option for the blue team. The Washington Post just reported that the DNC will, quote, support Biden's reelection and has, quote, no plans to sponsor primary debates. It should be noted that this isn't with the caveat that challengers meet a certain level of support or donations. No, they've decided from the start that this just won't be happening. This statement is especially bonkers given the fact that Americans have made it very clear that they don't want another 4 years of Biden. Don't take my word for it. Polls are showing that 73% of voters wish he wouldn't run again, and that includes a large majority of Democrats. I mean, let's be real, voters aren't stupid. Given the fact that he will be 86 at the end of his presidency and the economy is literally in the garbage, you would think that Democrats would be open to an alternative. Unfortunately, they're not. And that follows a disturbing trend. There's only been one other time in history when a sitting elected president wasn't nominated for a second term. Yes, only one. Back in 1852, Franklin Pierce's Democratic Party told him no thanks over the issue of slavery. So needless to say, there was no way the Dems would voluntarily give Biden the boot. Again, it really doesn't make sense. With Joe's poll numbers being lower than low throughout his presidency, you'd expect Democrats to be crossing their fingers for a challenger to emerge, especially now with the threat of a Trump rematch looming. But what Washington does rarely makes sense. Whether the DNC wants to recognize it, Biden does have two challengers for the White House. Marianne Williamson, a former presidential candidate, an author, and the other, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., an environmental lawyer, and like the name suggests, the nephew of John F. Kennedy. But this video isn't really about them specifically. It's about the whole idea of primary challengers. Do they really stand a chance of winning? What happens when they come close? And what does their acceptance say about our democracy as a whole? If you don't know, and to be honest, I had to look it up to be sure, no president has ever lost to a primary challenger. Now wait, before you click off the video and think that's the end of the story, it's not. When challengers come close, that's the beginning. Which just might be why the Democrats are trying to ignore their presence. When it comes to primary challengers, there's been 3 times when a sitting president got more than they bargained for. And all 3 times have connections to what Biden will face in 2024. Watch while history repeats. Number 1, Lyndon B. Johnson. In 1968, in the middle of the Vietnam War, Johnson tried his hand at another term, only to be challenged by Eugene McCarthy. Now, McCarthy ran on a platform opposing the war, similar to the situation Biden now faces against Kennedy opposing the war in Ukraine. And although Johnson won the New Hampshire primary race, it was only barely. McCarthy took 42% of the vote compared to LBJ's 48%. So he must have seen the writing on the wall since he suddenly and unexpectedly withdrew. Historians think that if he had stayed in, he still would have lost to Nixon, given the Americans' hatred of the war and his notable failures in addressing rising poverty. Number 2, Jimmy Carter. Johnson's not alone. In 1980, Jimmy Carter faced a strong challenger too. Ted Kennedy challenged Carter and beat him in 12 primary races. And again, eerily similar to Biden's current situation, Carter was facing an oil crisis and rising inflation. Sounds familiar, right? Especially with our rising inflation and gas prices. We didn't end up with a second president named Kennedy, since Ronald Reagan ended up winning by a landslide. But given the history, this is probably why Democrats don't want their candidate to face the criticism Carter did with Kennedy. Number 3, George Bush Sr. Now, Democratic presidents aren't the only ones to be affected by challengers in primaries. In 1992, George Bush Sr. lost the support of his party, but ran anyway. Republicans were angry with George for raising taxes after promising not to, and Pat Buchanan saw that anger and ran with it. He took a quarter of the vote during the New Hampshire primary, and although Bush won the rest of his races, between this and Ross Perot running as an independent, he lost. And to add insult to injury, Bill Clinton won the presidency despite not winning the majority of the popular vote. Given the history of primary challengers breaking the status quo, it's easy to see why the mainstream media and the DNC have decided to just stick their heads in the sand. But acting as though there are no challengers opposing Biden, let alone choices for the voters, isn't democratic. The fact is that our current president will go down in history as giving the least amount of press conferences and press interviews. Even his campaign announcement was delivered as a video. So while his announcement talks about saving democracy, not having debates sets a precedent that is a bigger threat to democracy than he or the DNC are willing to admit. And the media pretending that Joe Biden being the sitting president makes him the automatic nominee is an attempt to put the democratic process on autopilot, something that every voter, no matter what party, should be disturbed by. No president should have the illusion that he's not accountable to the people, which is exactly the position Joe Biden is being put in. He's been given the nomination before the race even began. Allowing for challengers to oppose a sitting president is a reminder to him and any president that nothing is given or automatic, especially not the party's presidential nomination.